Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here today. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds before we start. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. So good afternoon. On behalf of UCLA School of Law and the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest in Law and Policy here at the law school. I'm Karen Wong. I am the Executive Director of the Epstein Program, and I am really delighted today to host today's event, which is our second Spring 2021 Margaret Levy Public Interest Fellow Lecture. And it's also our first ever UCLA Law alum Levy Fellow, so I'm really excited about that. I'm going to be back for the Q&A portion of today's program, but I'm going to now hand the program over to our Dean, Jennifer Mnookin. And thank you, Jennifer, for your deep support of this program and to the law and for the law school public interest community. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to welcome all of you to the latest in this tremendous series of lectures by our distinguished Margaret Levy Fellows, presented by the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy. This is the second lecture of the semester, and I know it's going to be tremendously interesting and energizing. As you know, our Levy Fellows include top thinkers, advocates, and innovators on the cutting edge of public interest law and policy. And in today's case, we're just so excited that it's also a UCLA Law School alum. I'm truly sorry that the pandemic means that we're not all meeting in person today, but I'm also grateful that we can do it this way. And it also means there aren't, planes people have to take, and it's easier to join in. But still, I am sorry that we can't be in person together. And before I do my introduction of today's terrific speaker, I want to acknowledge that UCLA Law School sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongue peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. I also very much want to thank Maggie Levy for her generosity and support that has permitted us to have these signature public interest programs. So Maggie, I don't know if you're out there listening, but I want to say thank you very, very much for your commitment and generosity. It's now my tremendous pleasure to introduce our second Spring 2021 Levy Fellow, Julian Harris-Calvin. And as I mentioned, she's the first Levy Fellow to be a UCLA law graduate from the class of 2013. And she's done just tremendous work in the period since she left us. And we are just hugely proud of her accomplishments and the work that she does. She's currently the director of the Greater Justice New York program at the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a criminal justice reform organization, and where she is one of the leading activists for criminal justice reform in this country. Her work is on the cutting edge. She leads efforts to identify and implement meaningful reform to bail, sentencing, parole, and more. And she works with and supports other leaders who are also driving movements to create positive change in the criminal justice system. It's an honor to be able to host her at UCLA Law this week in several virtual meetings and presentations. Today's lecture will be titled Putting It All Together, Supporting Movements Through Data, Storytelling, and Policy Expertise. And Julian's really a perfect person to discuss the rapidly developing ways in which lawyers and lawyers-to-be can learn and advocate for substantive change at a moment when criminal justice is very much at the heart of the national conversation, and where succeeding in creating change often requires data, storytelling, and policy expertise all mixed together. Julian earned her undergraduate degree at USC across town, and then became a Bruin, and in 2013 graduated from UCLA Law School, where she specialized in both critical race studies and public interest law and policy. She's also previously been senior counsel at the Justice Collaborative. She worked as a public defender in both New York and Washington, D.C., and she was also the director of administration for an LA councilman. So she's had a tremendous set of varied and impactful career opportunities, and it's going to be very interesting to hear her talk to us today. So Julian, welcome back. Thank you so much for coming back for this talk and for being here. Thanks for joining us this week, including for today's lecture. And so please, everybody, please join me in giving a very warm, if virtual, welcome to Julian Harris-Calvin. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm very honored and was just shocked and just grateful that you all invited me to be here and are interested in the work that I do, the work that the Vera Institute does, and the lane in which I do my work currently and previously after I left the Federal Defenders of New York and was no longer a public defender. So thanks for all the hellos in the chat, everyone. And I'm grateful that you're here to join us. I hope you learned something, and I hope you guys have really good questions for the end. I hope we have enough time for that. If not, the career chat and then the office hours with students is something I really look forward to because I really like to engage with them and also the faculty whom I love and I miss learning from. And I hope we're proud of this presentation today, but I welcome any feedback that you all have as well. So as Dean Mnookin said, the title of today's lecture is Putting It All Together, Supporting Movements Through Data, Storytelling, and Expertise. And, before we get into where I, or as other folks who are lawyers or who are law students looking to get out into the field of social movement lawyering, we first need to define what that is. What is social movement lawyering? And if Jamie, you can just switch to the next slide, that'd be helpful. So I'm going to use the definition that Marbury Solly-Butts gave in her lecture last month when she was quoting Betty Hung, that says, social movement lawyering is lawyering that supports and advances social movements, defined as the building and exercise of collective power, led by the most directly impacted to achieve systemic, institutional, and cultural change. And that definition is both enlightening and inviting of a couple existential questions, I think, for lawyers and for students, law students alike. The first is, where do I, as a lawyer, fit into a powerful and necessary movement for change? And the second is, how do I do it right and not muck it up? And it could feel like we have to pick sides, even if we are looking to work within a single social movement or component of that movement. Next slide, please. For example, the conversation and movement around addressing the size, scope, and role, if any, of policing is one that can be a little fraught, right? Some organizations call for straight abolition as the ultimate goal. Some use the term defund, others argue that defund or abolish is language that's so off-putting to the powers that be that it's counterproductive to the movement. And those people then propose language such as divest, invest, or budget justice, or something like we need to shrink the carceral footprint as alternative language that is more palatable for communities outside those impacted, those that are impacted by over-policing, over-surveilling, and mass incarceration. And then we get to a place where it feels a little overwhelming, right? We get to this place where there's all this squabbling and infighting about who's right and what dominant theory of change or strategic position or righteous choice is the choice, the one around which everyone should coalesce in the movement. And this is what some people call purity culture. But what I and others argue is that this feeling that I must find and latch on to the most righteous approach emerges from too myopic a vision, one that ignores the interdependence and impact of disparate theories of change, disparate social political positioning, and different strategy in truly affecting transformation. I would argue that nearly all of these places, all of these terms, at least in the policing context, right, are necessary because we each play a role within the broader movement ecology. Next slide, please. So movement ecology has many definitions. I have broken the rule of PowerPoint presentations, which says do not fill the slide with a bunch of words that people have to read. but I'm doing this because I really like this definition that's been provided by the INE Institute. And I think it really illustrates what the movement ecology is and how the different components of it relate to each other. And so the definition is, as fish in water, we sometimes forget not only the culture we're swimming in, but also the larger ecosystem we're part of. Beyond our organizations, there are campaigns, movements, cultures, communities, and institutions that are trying to make change in their own way. The dominant culture of isolation and individualism can confuse us into thinking that we are alone at the center, rather than integrally connected to a network of change makers with diverse theories of change. Ecology shows that diversity and mutualism, rather than monoculture and antagonism, that purity culture I was talking about, are the conditions for strength and survival. If we saw our work ecologically, we would be more supported and more successful. And so this reminds me of something that Jennifer Austin Jones said during a panel discussion that we were having a couple weekends ago in New York City around the conversation of defund, divest, or budget justice. Next slide. And there's some more language, and I promise not all my slides are going to be this dense, but she said what we're really talking about here when we're talking about the movement ecology and where all of this terminology or these players kind of fit is that we're talking about war position versus war maneuver. Defund police is a war maneuver term, she says. It's an agitate term. And then there are people who sit at the table who are occupying seats from a war position. And they have to do the work of translating what is being said at the war maneuver end. So it isn't that defund the police is an outright bad term and that we shouldn't be using it. Yes, that language is what got us here. That language is why we're at the table having a conversation about police budgets. But you have to do the work of translating what that means for people who don't want to hear it. And budget justice is a term that translates for people so that they can get more comfortable with that language if you need them to come along and move on the budget transformation front. And we'll revisit this again when I talk about some of the work that I do and what we at the Bureau of Institute of Justice have already done around the New York City Police Department budget last year. But I think what this conversation around defund and divest highlights is this inside versus outside dichotomy that lawyers, movement players, and law students who are choosing where to fit often come up against. And I think law school tends to provide us with this very limited view of how we as lawyers can create and support social movements, usually in relation to our proximity to a dominant institution. And in the work I do, that dominant institution is usually the government, whether it's the federal government or local or state, county, and the like. And so what we're often taught in law school is that your role is either inside or outside. And those are the two lanes and the only lanes in which to support movements. Next slide, please. And typically, the outside lane is composed of folks who are working outside of dominant institutions to change those institutions, systems, or culture, or to create alternative systems. So some examples are listed here, and there are many more. This is not a complete exhaustive list, but there are labor unions like the United Farm Workers of America, led by Cesar Chavez and Doris Huerta. There's activism and community organizing like Asian Americans for Equality, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, led by Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera here in New York. There's BLM, the American Indian Movement, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, if you want to take it back a couple generations, and then ACT UP, right? There's also electoral work and organizations like Working Families Party, Democratic Socialists of America, and Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight voting rights organization fit in that bucket. And we have, I think what we all certainly learn a lot about in law school, we have impact litigation, you know, NAACP, Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the world-renowned ACLU. We also have legal aid organizations, and that's public defenders, direct services organizations, folks really on the ground in the trenches doing the work with clients, with members of this community who are leading the fight and are the reason and at the core of social movements. Then we have journalists, academics, nonprofit think tanks, which we all know a lot about in the law school context. And then there are institutions or organizations rather that are pushing for and creating alternatives to the dominant institution, to that inside lane. And those are folks like the Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, Brazil's movement of landless workers, the Zapatistas, and then also mutual aid collectives and the like. Next slide, please. And all of these different buckets are different theories of change. They're different places in the ecosystem, right? But they're outside in the outside lane. And their theories of change are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but often overlapping and fluid. You could think about Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, whose lessons many of our social movements in the States have incorporated. There's MST, which is the Brazilian movement of landless workers, and the Black Panther Party. Their alternatives became part of the dominant institutions. For instance, the most well-known for Black Panther Party is the free lunch program and their public health initiatives that were adopted by local and federal governments. MST, their schools, their alternative schools, actually became the main educational institutions in certain regions in Brazil. And then we think about people like Martin Luther King Jr., that, whom as CRS students, we know a whole lot more about that movement. But I think growing up in traditional settings in grade school and even in college, what we predominantly learn about his fight is his fight to end segregation and voting rights. And then most of us here today know that he was actually a union man. He was assassinated in Memphis to support a sanitation workers' strike. He was committed to cross-racial anti-poverty initiatives at the time of his death. He was organizing the Poor People's March on Washington. He preached vehemently against the Vietnam War. And, the 1963 March on Washington, where his famous I Have a Dream speech was actually called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And it was organized by a coalition of folks with different places in the movement ecology, but also different theories of change and social issues that they were targeting. So there was SNCC, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Congress of Racial Equity, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and the National Urban League. And again, this is another example, like what I mentioned with the Black Panther Party, with Gandhi and MST, where different theories of change are overlapping and fluid, and there are obviously intersections in terms of the identities of those folks who are at the core of those movements and those issues. Next slide, please. And so we have the outside lane, which is huge and diverse, and I only touched the very, very tip of the iceberg when giving you examples of players in that outside lane. But again, they're defined outside of the dominant institution. They're working outside of that institution. The inside lane, those are people who are working within the dominant institution to effectuate change, or frankly, to maintain the status quo, right? So we have elected officials, civil servants, judges, prosecutors, and other government lawyers, and then political staffers. And the inside and outside lane lawyers can have shared goals, right? But they face similar and distinct limitations. So a shared goal between movement lawyers on the outside and lawyers who are at the very least sympathetic to the movement on the inside is that what they're trying to do, what the movement is trying to do, is trying to persuade decision makers within the dominant institution to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. So for example, in the electoral context, that means they want to push elected officials to make the right choice. And if they don't, they're going to push them out of office, right? And they also have shared limitations. The most obvious of that is that that movement lawyer or that lawyer, whether they identify as movement or not, is usually not the actual decision maker, and they likely will not be that decision maker, at least for many years, right? And so when you're on the inside lane, if you're a staffer, you're a law clerk, you're a civil servant, for much, if not all of your career, you're trying to persuade your boss to make a decision. And you're doing that with little capital, because your boss is often beholden to a constituency, to a donor base, to a party or caucus, or to their own personal values, interests, or platform. And your job as that staffer or law clerk or civil servant, your job is to execute the vision of your boss, not the other way around. So you can often tinker around the edges, push a little bit, but that is not the definition of radical change, right? And so a classic example that I've taken just from the work that I've done and my interest in public defense is, when I talk to law students who want to be prosecutors. And they say they want to be prosecutors so that they can wield their discretion with fairness and equity and with an eye toward limiting mass incarceration, right? And I say that's great. It's great that you want to do that. It's great that you're aligned with this movement. But what does that mean practically? You're coming in as a prosecutor, you're a line prosecutor, right? You're not making decisions about, entire categories of offenses that you are never going to prosecute, right? You can't say that as a line prosecutor. You often cannot make unilateral decisions about, what kind of alternatives to incarceration that you are going to use at your disposal to help people avoid prison or jail. You're not able to make unilateral decisions, about whether or not to make pre-plea offers versus post-plea offers, right? Unless you go through your supervisor, and your supervisor gets their internal policy direction from the district attorney, the US attorney, the attorney general, and that trickles down to you, right? And so again, you can tinker around the edges within this framework that is way above your pay grade and one that you are not going to get to for God knows how long, right? And another shared limitation between folks that are inside and outside, well, it's actually, this limitation is not shared. This is a limitation that is specific to inside lane actors, which is that usually inside lane actors are not members of an impacted community or the impacted community at the core and the heart of the movement or the issue driving the movement, right? Social movements are largely propelled by marginalized communities who do not sit at the center of power. As an inside player, you're sitting at the center of power. And even if you happen to be that exception who is a member of that impacted community, you are often the sole member of that impacted community. And therefore, you do not have a lot of power to steer the ship, right? To change the direction and the trajectory of the institution in which you work. And so if we look at the outside lane, right, and the limitations of those who are on the outside, again, like the inside lane folks, you are not the decision maker. You are pushing someone who has the power to make decisions, sometimes with the stroke of a pen, right? You're pushing them to make the right choice. And sometimes as an outside player, you have an adversarial relationship with those decision makers that you are pushing, right? Or you have an adversarial relationship with their core constituency or the prevailing rhetoric around an issue. Oftentimes when you are approaching that decision maker, that government actor, for instance, oftentimes reacts defensively, right? They act defensively and their interests are aligned with the status quo or close to the status quo. Therefore, they're not interested in what you're talking about, right? And so that leads to distrust between those pushing for change and the decision makers with the institutional power. Now, obviously, I'm talking in broad strokes, right? And there's always, there are instances of different dynamic, but generally speaking, in terms of inside and outside lane, that is the dynamic between the outside lane folks and the, in this case, the government actor, the dominant institution that you're trying to push to do something they don't want to do, right? And so we're left with two lanes within the movement ecosystem tethered by this tense and often distrusting relationship. Next slide, please. And look, like I said, there are exceptions. Sometimes folks jump from one lane to the other. The Constance Baker Motley and Thurgood Marshalls of the world go from litigating, doing impact litigation and being part of the NAACP to becoming the decision maker on a federal bench, right? These days we see people like AOC or Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, whose name I never pronounced correctly, sorry, going from an outside agitator to a decision maker on the inside, right? And that is happening much more frequently these days because of the movements, because of the outside agitation, and because of, at the very least, for the use of electoral politics to get people to shift from the outside to the inside so that they are the decision maker. You could be Chesa and be the DA of San Francisco without being within his office, making choices and wielding discretion in a way that you don't think is appropriate for 10 or 15 years. He can go from being a public defender straight to being the district attorney. And so that does happen. We see it happen, and it's happening more and more frequently, thankfully for our movements. But you are still on the inside. You've left the outside, you're on the inside, and there are different dynamics at play once you're on the inside, and part of that dominant institution is one of many players. Next slide, please. So there is another lesser discussed position within the movement ecology that can act as connective tissue between the outside lane and the government actors. Now, the connective tissue is one that leverages the credibility developed through relationships with folks in both lanes to help influence decision makers and bring about the impact that movement partners want to see, right? And that's where programs like mine at the Vera Institute of Justice sit in the greater movement ecology. Next slide. The core tools we use to create those relationships, which give us that influence and impact, are our data and research, our policy analysis, and to a greater extent these days, our advocacy and strategic communications. So in terms of research and data analysis, more than half of my team are researchers. They pull data, they clean data, they analyze data, they package data, and they share that data with organizers, activists, and movement partners on the ground to support them in mapping the scope and depth of the problem, as well as crafting solutions. But also, we share data with elected officials, policymakers, and other decision makers to help translate, like Jennifer Jones-Austin was saying in that quote I talked about earlier, to translate, educate, and inform, not from an adversarial vantage point usually, or by using disruption as a tool, but through formal and informal relationships with those inside lane partners. So we do it through formal and informal relationships, through formal and informal conversation. And often we do this with discretion and in confidence for both sides, right? And so, you know, we've got these outside lane folks identifying a problem, drawing attention to it, disrupting the status quo, and calling on decision makers, the people with the power to transform systems, calling on them to do something, right? To make change, to transform the justice system, to transform policing, to transform the budget, whatever the issue is that's at the core of their movement, right? And then we've got the folks on the inside lane who are often like, people are telling me I need to do this thing, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know what it is. It's scary. I don't like it, blah. And I'm not quite sure how or why I should be doing this, right? But they're yelling at me. And the media is at my front door and they're picketing in front of my house. What do I do? So this is where like Vera really gets to work, right? And the connective tissue partners like Vera really get to work because we have these very local, long-term relationships that allow us to go to the decision maker with the same facts that the folks in the outside lane have, facts that they've curated, or facts that we've given them and they've taken and used as part of their strategy, right? So we go to these decision makers with the same facts as those wielded by the outside lane partners. We translate it and we explain to them, right, how to meet the demands of the community without fearing a loss of their job or like anarchy, right? And so that is a special role that we have by being that connective tissue when there is that tense connection between the inside and the outside lane. Next slide, please, Jamie. So one example I can think of, just building off of the example I was giving with Jennifer Jones Austin's quote earlier, is the 2020 New York Police Department budget fight. And I should say that, you know, I run the Greater Justice New York program in New York State. And so a lot of the work that I do in New York is in New York, excuse me, almost exclusively in New York. But Vera has 2 other place-based offices that do the exact same kind of work that I do, but in California and in New Orleans, Louisiana generally, but it's based in New Orleans. And then we have a federal office. And so part of the relationship building that we do at Vera happens hyper locally. And so we can really get into the weeds of things like the budget justice fight here in New York City, the bail and jails fight happening in New Orleans, and also the men's central jail closure fight that is ongoing right now in Los Angeles that my counterpart, Michelle Paris, in the Vera office in LA is part of, right? So here in New York, one example of, you know, how we come in when the outside lane partners are getting this push from, the inside lane partners are getting this push from outside lane, and they're like, what do I do? And how we can leverage our data and our research to help both inform both sides, to help both sides strategize, and to bridge that gap is the budget fight here in New York last summer. So what happened here was, I mean, as all of us know, last summer was very unique and a groundbreaking summer because of this racial justice reckoning that occurred across the country. And New York was one of the places where it really blew up after the murder of George Floyd and the many murders police murders that preceded his death, right? And so what the folks here in New York were saying, the outside lane movement partners were saying, you need to cut $1 billion from New York City's policing budget. The NYPD's budget is $6 billion. It's too much. You need to take that money and give it back to the community, right? And the question for the electeds and movement partners was, you know, cut it from where? Where do we cut it and where do we put it, right? I think the movement partners knew where to put it. But the elected specifically were like, where do we put it and where do we cut it from? And so what Vera did was, once we talked to the folks on the ground, our movement partners, and we start digging into the police budget, what we find out is that actually New York City spends $11 billion on policing. $6 billion is the operating budget for NYPD, but there is about $5 billion outside of the police operating budget. That means that New York City is spending totally $11 billion, right? And so $1 billion from $6 billion feels like a whole lot more than $1 billion from $11 billion, right? And so we laid out exactly where the funds are spent and which can't be touched, right? And which can be touched. For instance, pensions are a large portion of the policing budget, not the biggest, but a large portion. That is not a component of the budget that we're gonna cut, right? So let's look elsewhere. And so we help to guide city council members' strategy for how much to cut and from where to cut and where to put it so that they could be responsive to the community members who are calling for the budget cuts and the reinvestment into the communities of color. So what we were able to do is we were able to put that $1 billion into context for both the decision makers, but also to help fact check the opposition who used fear mongering and misinformation to obstruct calls for cuts, right? And so you'll see on this slide, on what's my left, I think you're seeing it on the left, we show the budget and where all of the money is coming from. So the big red circle is the $6 billion operating, and then you see all these other locations in the broader city budget that show how money is being spent on NYPD. And then we have the right side of the slide that shows, okay, where is that money? Where is it duplicative, right? Where is it being used in places the community does not want to see police? And how much money does that cost? And how can we take that money and then do what the community is saying, take that money and put it into the communities most affected and most harmed by over-policing, over-surveillance, and mass incarceration. So that's just one example of how we can use our data and research. We can leverage our data and research to create relationships, credible relationships, and then bridge the gap between the two lanes. And I'm sorry for mixing my metaphors, but I don't know what to tell you. That's just what I'm doing today. Okay, so next slide, please, Jamie. We also use our policy and analysis. We take, sorry, let me back up a little bit. So the second tool that we use other than the data and the research is policy analysis, right? So it's data and research, policy analysis, and strategic communication. So with our policy analysis, we take that data and research and we propose policy changes, whether as an internal policy, say if we're doing technical assistance within a newly elected prosecutor's office to help them create policies that better use their discretion to shrink the carceral state and to not criminalize and prosecute every Black and brown person on the planet. So we can use it for internal policies like that, or through legislative and regulatory change, right? And so one example is New York State jail staffing. So what we did when we were digging into budgets is that New York was spending, our spending on jails has continued to rise despite historic declines in jail populations across the state. Our spending is primarily driven by mandatory jail staffing requirements that are tethered to each jail's maximum capacity instead of the actual numbers of incarcerated people in those jails. So in some places like New York City, the correction officer to incarcerated person ratio got as high as 2 or 3 officers per single person in jail. And that meant that about 86% of the city's $2.3 billion corrections budget went to personnel costs, not food, not programming, not rehabilitation, not medical costs, none of that. It went to just paying salaries, fringe benefits, pensions, those kinds of things. And so what we realized, and again, in collaboration with movement partners whose goal is to, whether it's abolish prison and jail or to shrink the carceral state, we all realized that if the state changed its mandatory staffing regulations, then counties across the state could save $638 million. And that's for all of the counties outside of New York City. Next slide, please. So what we did here was we created a narrative illustrating the fiscal waste of the state, especially in this public health and economic crisis brought about by COVID-19. And we showed them how that money could be reinvested into solving for those problems, the crises that our state, but most states were grappling to address, right? With $638 million, we could provide supportive housing for more than 36,000 people, or pay 1 year of rent for more than 53,000 people, or fund more than 10,500 social workers to respond to mental health and drug crises, right? And so that is the way that we go from the data, right, to the policy, right? We have the data that shows you're wasting money. We show that you're wasting money and you got a lot of places to put it that are better investments in our public dollars. There is this policy, there is this law, these regulations that are obstructing this reinvestment of corrections money into places where it counts and where you and your constituency really want to see investment. And so that's how we get from the data to the policy. And again, this is not in a vacuum, but in consultation with the folks in the movement, right? For both the jail staffing and the policing work, right? When we go into the individual counties and we say, hey, you're wasting X amount of money for this county, your component, your portion of that 638 million is 30 million, right? This is what you can do in your county, right? Your specific county to reinvest that money, right? You can, if the regulations don't pass, you can shut down, you can close jails, you can close units, right? You can continue to decarcerate, and then you could take that money and do XYZ, because the XYZ is what your particular community and your particular county wants. Now, I don't have the expertise to say what Dutchess County, New York wants, right? So we're doing this in collaboration with folks who are living there, who are part of the movement, who have been organizing and campaigning, and who are actually impacted. And they've been doing this for decades, right? They have the expertise, they have the real world experience, and they have the foresight to understand how policy change actually plays out on the ground, affects the communities that we all serve, and could bring about unintended consequences from well-meaning policy change, right? And so sometimes the outside lane is not in relationship with and is not hearing the inside lane. And what we could do is take their expertise and say, well, what they're telling us, what their expertise says is, this is going to bring about an unintended consequence that harms the community that you think you're helping by reinvesting this $20 million into, I don't know, a playground or something, right? And so it's all in collaboration, and it's all to be that connective tissue between those two sides. And just, so the end of the story with the jail staffing is that this year, New York Governor Cuomo included regulatory changes to the jail staffing requirements in his fiscal year 2022 budget as part of our internal communications with his budget office. We also have Senate and Assembly sponsors who have proposed a legislative fix if the governor's regulations don't turn out to be what the community wants the regulations to look like. Next slide. Thank you. And then that third tool of data research, policy, and strategic communications is what we have here. So most of what social movements do is change how people feel about an issue, right? The underlying facts themselves typically have not changed, but how people feel about those facts, that does change, right? So for example, cops have been killing Black people since policing was invented in the United States, right? LGBTQ people have existed since the beginning of time, and they've been criminalized, at least in this country, but other countries for centuries, even millennia. So how we as a society feel about that dynamic has changed. And so law, institutions, and cultures are starting to follow the changed feelings, right? And this is an example of what political scientists call shifting the Overton window, which is something you can look up later that I'm not an expert on, but that's kind of the tagline for changing the way people feel, and then the politicians or dominant institutions then feeling okay with following that lead and implementing the changes that those folks are asking for, the movement is asking for. And because of Vera's position journalists seek our expertise and data to fill in the contours of their stories, but also to help them frame the problem and the solution. And it's often timed around a report that Vera does or an event in Albany or City Hall, right? And so they'll call us and say, okay, but what does the data say? Or what are you hearing from movement partners? What's really going on the ground? And obviously, we'll then say, you should also talk to, people at release aging prisoners, right? What we also do, other than journalists seeking our advice and our data and our expertise, is to pitch and place articles, op-eds, essays under our own name, or we'll ghostwrite them for other people, like politicians, movement leaders, impacted folks. We also do a lot of work around framing issues and narrative, right? So we'll draft talking points, and we'll do one set for movement partners, right? Because they have a role and they have a particular voice and frame, right? So we can feed them talking points, right? Based on the same data that we're feeding inside lane partners. And they can't necessarily say the same thing that the other person says because of their place in the ecosystem, who their audience is, who they're supported by, but we can help create and craft talking points to help frame the issues and the narrative that helps us shift the Overton window, that helps us change how people feel about facts that really haven't changed, right? We create social media toolkits, sign-on letters, press briefings, we do backgrounders, and then sometimes we do crisis communications and rapid response work for, let's say, newly elected prosecutors who are trying to do the right thing, right? But are getting pushback from the Fraternal Order of Police in their local jurisdiction or other tough on crime entities, or just bad press. So we'll do some crisis communications and rapid response around the issues. Next slide, please. And so what I've realized, having gone from law school, from working in City Hall in Los Angeles to law school, to being a public defender in DC, and then a public defender in federal court, and now doing policy work, and all of these other layers of kind of connective tissue work that I did at the Justice Collaborative and now at Vera, is that navigating this space in the ecosystem doesn't really require skills much different from what I employed as a trial lawyer, right? Storytelling, evidence, and expertise. That is what we're using, right? That is what I'm doing now, and that's what I did as a public defender. Storytelling, you're framing a narrative that illustrates what's happening, why it's happening, and how decision makers should feel about and act on it. As a public defender, that was the jury or the judge. And now it's institutional actors, right? The dominant institutional actors. In terms of evidence, right? I use data and research, right? I use data and research to help inform that story, to help inform the audience. As a public defender, I did the same thing with investigation, with experts. And I think anyone here who wants to be a public defender has to know that investigation wins cases. You cannot win a case if you have not investigated that case and gotten the evidence, gotten a perspective on the evidence, gotten a perspective on the data, right? Behind this case, or behind, as a movement lawyer, this movement or the issue around the movement, underlying the movement. And then the third is expertise, right? Centering, this is a little trickier, right? But the expertise doesn't come from me. It didn't come from me as a trial lawyer, as a public defender. It doesn't come from me now as someone who has a place in the movement ecosystem as a lawyer, right? As a public defender, my client always had the expertise, right? If my client is charged with a gun case, possession of a gun or a shooting, or a drug possession or drug dealing case, right? And so my client is from that neighborhood, right? The neighborhood that is over police, the neighborhood that the police have gone in and done a sting in, right? And that person knows how things usually, knows how things work on the ground, right? And this prosecutor, especially when I was in federal court at SDNY, they don't know anything about the lives my clients live, right? They don't know about that life. They don't know about the community. They don't know how things work on the ground. They are from a different universe, right? And so they have their very academic law school way, like hypothetical fact pattern way of crafting a theory of the case, a theory of what happened on the ground and litigating that case. My client, as a public defender, can tell me exactly how things, I don't have that experience either, to be fair, but they can tell me exactly how things work on the ground, right? They can say, you need to go investigate this. You need to see what so-and-so says. Actually, this is how things really go down. This is the time of night things happen. You know, they have the expertise about their own lived experience, right? To tell me how to poke holes in the government's case, or to tell me how the government don't know what they're talking about, or to tell me how to cross-examine, to tell me what my defense theory should be, what my strategy should be, what questions I should be asking or shouldn't be asking, what I should ask for a sentence or shouldn't ask for, whether we go to trial or not go to trial, right? They've got that expertise. The same thing happens as a movement lawyer, right? I don't have the expertise, right, on how closing Rikers Island should be done, or how it affects folks who come through the criminal legal system in New York City, right? So the people who are leading the movement to close Rikers Island in New York City, those are people, the people who are leading the movement are impacted people. Those are people who've been to Rikers. Those are people who have been in solitary confinement for extended periods of time. They're the ones that can tell us, right? They're the ones we serve, and they're the ones who can tell us how things really operate and how we need to address those problems, and what we should not take as responses or should not take as solutions from those dominant institutions, right? And so we bring the expertise as the connective tissue, but we are not the experts. And so this is really the same, I'm just doing the same job at a different place in the ecosystem, I like to think, because I always want to say I'm a public defender. Next slide. Thanks, Jamie. Okay, and so I say all that to say, we're at the end of my talk now, is that we have, like I have but one role in this large ecosystem, right? My role does not and cannot create change on its own. There's no role in that ecosystem that can create change on its own. And I'm certainly not a central player, right? And you know, if Mariam Covey and others hadn't been beating the drum of abolition for decades, or if BLM hadn't been forcing us to hear and recognize that Black Lives Matter for over 7 years, well before George Floyd was murdered, before city leaders were painting it on main streets, and while everyone was pushing back with, but you really mean all lives matter, right? If New York and Communities United for Policing didn't fight for many years for public inspection of police records, and a coalition of impacted New Yorkers and advocates and organizers hadn't fought for the closure of Rikers Island for generations, then at least in New York, the state wouldn't have passed bail reform in 2019. We wouldn't have repealed laws sealing police misconduct records. We wouldn't have guaranteed that our new marijuana legalization law specifically benefits Black and Brown communities harmed by our nation's racist war on drugs. And the city of New York would not have committed to closing our nation's last penal colony by 2026. Right? I have but one role, but if those folks on the outside lane were not beating the drum and fighting and gathering and really building and coalescing their expertise, none of these things would have happened, and no further social movement change can happen. And all that we can do in my role is to just be the connective tissue when it's needed, because we're not always needed. Sometimes we're just like, hey, you want some data? And they're like, sure, give us the data, but stay on the side. And that's cool too. Right. And so I say all of that to say, and I presented this lecture because I really did feel that in law school, we just get stuck in these two lanes, and we get stuck with this purity culture argument internally. But there is at least one other lane, and that is the lane that I sit in, where we can create that connective tissue, and where we can realize that we're all part of an ecology, and we all have a role, and from my perspective, now no one role is more important or most important, or actually the right theory of change that you have to abide by to move a movement forward. So with that, I guess I'll just take any questions folks have.
Great, thank you, Julian. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to turn my camera back on. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a very hectic, busy period in your day-to-day work with the Vera Institute. And we want to now shift to the remaining time to questions. You know, as you know, as an alum, many of our students are very passionate about criminal injustice or the criminal injustice system, and many are dedicating their legal careers to the kinds of issues you spoke about and just the broader kind of issues of criminal justice and reforming the system. So for the Q&A session, I'm delighted to welcome two current UCLA law students. We thought that by having a couple of live students, it would help bridge this Zoom webinar divide between speakers and audience members. And very briefly, the two students are Angel Lee, who is a current 2L, and she's specializing in both public interest and critical race studies. She's seriously considering public defense for her career, although her broader interests are restorative and transformative justice, movement lawyering, and abolition. She's going to be working for the Department of Public Defense in King County, Washington this summer, and with the Public Defender Agency in Anchorage, Alaska in the fall. Our other student is Maya Chowdhury, who is a 3L, also a PILP and CRS student. And she spent 5 years as an investigator at the Southern Center for Human Rights before law school. She worked on conditions of confinement, right to counsel, fines and fees litigation. She spent actually one summer at PDS in DC, so you have that in common. And it was also at the Promise of Justice Initiative. And after graduation, she is going to be joining the Texas Fair Defense Project as a fellow to do work challenging wealth-based detention. So thank you to both Angel and Maya for participating today. I'll just briefly say that I will keep an eye on anything submitted through the audience Q&A tool. So if you have questions, feel free to post it there. I'm going to actually ask Angel and Maya to ask a few questions before, and we'll see how I guess we're doing the time and see if we have time to pull questions from the chat or for additional questions from Angel and Maya. So with that, I wanted to ask Maya to start with a question, and then we'll turn to Angel. So go ahead.
Thank you so much for your talk today. It was really incredible. And it made me think about a lot of things I was already thinking about in, just more nuanced ways. And I think one of the things I wanted to ask you was when you talked about that quest for diversity and mutualism, I was trying to think about what are practical ways that we as lawyers can work to make sure that we are addressing the power dynamics between lawyers and non-lawyers and avoiding replicating hierarchies that are existing outside the movement and that the movements themselves are trying to destroy. And so, what are, I think you did all of your, presentation was about uplifting these impacted people and non-lawyers. And I was just wondering more specifically, especially in what you're calling the outside lane, what can we be doing practically there?
Yeah, that is a question that I think we all have. Well, those of us that are doing it right, I suppose, are all asking ourselves, right? And I think it's actually the outside lane partners that do a better job of that, I think, right? And they keep me honest. They keep us who are closer to the inside lane or coming from the inside lane, they keep us honest, right? To make sure that we are not trying to replace our priorities or strategy or concerns or just power with theirs, right? And so I can't say that I could sit here and tell you, I've never been on the outside lane, and I certainly can't tell anybody on the outside lane how to do their jobs, right? But I do know that this is a conversation that we are constantly having. And I think, one thing that outside lane partners do a good job of is making sure that, outside lane organizations or communities are led by, for my purposes, formerly incarcerated people, right? And they're being paid for their leadership, right? They're being paid to do the work. It's not an extractive kind of dynamic, which again, I think reinforces the hierarchies you were talking about, right? And the power dynamics you were talking about. No, they are running these organizations, or they're in the leadership of the organizations, or they have a a leadership role at the table, and not tokenizing that either. Like there's not just like a bunch of white cis like straight dudes, right? And this like guy that went to jail once, right? It's like they are the core of that organization, the core of that community, and the core of the leadership. And so that's how I see people make sure that that dynamic, or at least guard against that dynamic that you are trying to address, and that I think we all are trying to be very cognizant of. Does that answer your question, Vera? And then obviously as a public defender, as you know, like, we do, our clients' express interest, not their best interest, is what guides our vision of what their best interest is. Like that's not what guides the relationship, the strategy, all of the different points that I mentioned earlier in the talk.
Thank you.
Is it my turn? Awesome. Hi. So similar to Maya, actually kind of works off of her question a little bit. You mentioned the drawbacks of purity culture and how it can actually choke movements instead of advance them. I guess through the creation of binaries and also failure to recognize that there are other constellations in the universe that aren't just us. As the connective tissue, what reference points do you use personally as you translate between those lanes to kind of ensure that you aren't over sterilizing or diluting something so much that the impacts suffer? For myself personally, there are instances where you're advocating for something and you get so frustrated because you realize at one point someone might not respond to the moral imperative, but they might respond to the economic imperative, but it feels terrible. So what do you do in those instances? And then kind of an original question was, how do movement lawyers kind of combat that fatigue when stories that pander might seem appealing because of their potential to succeed, even if it might feel terrible in the long run and also really harm a client?
Yeah, can I start with your last question? Because I'll forget it otherwise. So I think the thing that comes to mind is something that's an analog, I think, to what you're talking about, just thinking from my inside lane or my kind of connective tissue position, right, is when we do work for prosecutors' offices, right? Like I'm not a prosecutor. I don't plan to be a prosecutor. I think there are problems with just the system as a whole, right? But we do work, particularly when I was at the Justice Collaborative, and I have colleagues whom I love at Vera who do strictly prosecutor work through the Reshaping Prosecution program that we do. And what we do is like technical assistance, right, internally at prosecutor offices, where a prosecutor either has decided they've been enlightened and they decided they want to do better, or there's a new, progressive prosecutor, as they call them, that comes into the office, right? And they're like, help me change, use my discretion, use my role, right? Like within the structure, we're not changing the whole criminal legal system structure, right? But like my role, my place in the structure, how can I use my power to help to do harm mitigation, right? It's harm mitigation, right? And so I'm like, oh, great, I'm gonna tell you how to prosecute people better, right? And I'm like a public defender. But at the end of the day, if there are 3,000 people fewer in jail because they're prosecuting better, then like harm has been reduced, right? Does someone who like me think that like prosecutors should exist? Maybe not, right? But until we get to a place where we can abolish prosecution in jails and prisons, for us, we think, well, this is harm mitigation. So even though it's icky, I don't like it, right? I might love the humans that we're working with, but like I don't like it. I don't like being inside a prosecutor office, technically assisting them to like prosecute better, but it's mitigating the harm and it's affecting the lives of people. And so I just have to do what I gotta do. If I say that I care about this work and I care about the humans whom I'm serving. Other question was the purity.
How do you
culture.
translate without sterilizing?
Yes. With that one, it's hard, right? And that's why, actually, quite frankly, sometimes everybody's mad at us, right? Our outside partners are pissed at us. Our inside partners are pissed at us because everyone, they're pulling this way and they're pulling this way, and we're just like trying, like the connective tissue is like stretch, 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 straight, and we're like, you know, we just like, can we pass something, right? But the something that gets passed is not what the community partners wanted, or like not as good, right? And it certainly is further than what the inside lane folks wanted to do, and now they got to answer to their constituents because they took a step too far, right? And so that is a tension that we always have to deal with. And I think what the strategy around trying not to like sterilize the message, right? Or even if the impact of the outcome is not what everybody wanted, making sure that we're not sterilizing the message, or actually, you know, just like framing the issue in a way that is not something that our community partners want, is making sure that we're constantly in relationship with them, constantly talking to them. Oftentimes we're all at the table with the governor's office, right? But I can say things that they can't say, and they can say things that I can't say. And the same with the governor, like, you know, maybe, you know, a legislator or the governor, whoever, might not be able to say something publicly, but they'll be like, if you can get so-and-so to say a thing, or if you can get the editorial board of our regional newspaper to say a thing, then I could say the thing, and then I could push the thing forward, right? And so if we're constantly in communication with each other about those things, then we can make sure that we're not like crossing that line that you're talking about. Does that make sense?
Karen, do I have time for one more question or no? It's okay if not.
I'm going to, yes, I'm going to, Maya has another question, and we'll try to get your question in. I want to pull at least one question from the chat before we close. So if you all could keep that in mind. But go ahead, Maya, and then I'll come back to you, Angel.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be quick, but one thing I love about Vera is the work that they do in so many different places. And I think a lot of us know that we've seen better trends and data in cities and areas with greater political power. And so I was wondering, thinking again about that connective tissue role, how do you adjust, especially to rural areas where we're not seeing improvement in the ways that we are in cities? We're in areas, you know, you talked about, you know, Louisiana versus New York work. So how do you think that changes, how do you think that connective tissue role changes based on the amount of political power in an area?
Yeah, that's a good question. We actually have, for that reason, we have programs that are, Vera has programs that are dedicated to rural work, right? So we have a program, one of my colleagues runs, called In Our Backyards, and it's focused specifically on rural jails, right, and rural prisons, and obviously shrinking that footprint, because, you know, it's just a completely, like you said, different dynamic, right? And so there has to be a different approach and different ways of engaging both the inside and outside for these like very unique rural dynamics, right? And so my colleague does that across the country. But for our place-based work, right, like the California work, the Louisiana work, the New York work, we also collaborate with our In Our Backyards partners, and we do that work in our more rural counties, right? I mean, New York has 62 counties, right? New York City is 5 of them, right? And there are a ton of rural ones. There's a lot of different ends of the spectrum outside of New York City, right? Or the more urban population centers. And so what it looks like, it looks pretty much the same, right? Like we just spend a lot of time in the rest of the state, right? I can't just sit in New York City and then go to Putnam County and be like, hey, do a thing, right? I don't have a relationship there. I don't know the organizers there, right? Our team spends a lot of time on the road, like facilitating those relationships, doing the same thing we do here in New York City. But it's all tailored to the data from those localities, or to the needs of the community, to the expressed interests of the impacted people who are living there, who are incarcerated there, or who return there after incarceration, right? So it's the same model for us, for our place-based work. We just have to physically, when it's not COVID, be there a lot. We spend a lot of time there.
Thank you.
Angel, did you still want to ask a last question?
I'll yield to the chat. I'll attend office hours or something else. Thank you, them.
So thank you, Angel, for doing that. Thank you to both Maya and Angel for your questions. I know there's several questions in the chat, and I apologize, I don't think we can get to them. They're very thoughtful questions. I'll make sure Julian sees them. But Julian, I wanted to close with one that I think is actually in the mind of a lot of our students. I think this one's actually being asked by an incoming student, but I'm going to paraphrase, William, the questions that you submitted, but basically it's the tension of, what role do public defenders play in the movement ecology, and sort of the challenge that many public defenders feel about both being part of the system, but also for many wanting to abolish the system altogether. And just, I think the question is asking for kind of, as a former public defender or someone working in this reform space, what are your thoughts? And if you want to kind of use this as a chance to kind of close out as well, that would be great, Julian.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that is, I used to be in hiring committee at one of my jobs, and as a public defender, and that would be the question that we ask people. And come to my office hours if you want to answer it. But we would ask the question, you hate the criminal justice system, or you're like, you call it racist, and you do all this work, and you write all these papers in law school about how it's like this jacked up racist system. But you realize you're usually asking the judge to send your client to jail, right? You're saying, like, after you lose that trial, right, you're going to go to sentencing, and you're saying, can you send my client to jail just for the bottom of the guideline range, right? Or you're saying, hey, can you put my client on probation, right? So like make them subject to the surveillance state, right? That is usually going to help push them back into the revolving door of incarceration, as opposed to actually help them reintegrate successfully. And that I think is a tension that we individually have to figure out on our own. For me, I found it meaningful on the individual level, right? I found it meaningful for my relationships with my clients, to be able to stand in the gap between them and the power of the United States government, right? And so we might lose, we might win this trial, right? But what I'm not doing is preventing you from having been, ushered into the criminal legal system that on its own, whether you get incarcerated after that or not, on its own has these consequences that are out of my control, right? And so for me, it was, but there is meaning in being the person who, when my client does get sent to jail for many years, they can look at me and say, thank you so much, you fought for me. And this is a effed up system. And I hate that I'm going to jail, but I know that someone fought for me and like listened to me and did what I wanted them to do, right? And that mattered to me. But I never for once thought that I'm like changing the system, because you're not. Maybe if you're lucky, you get the one case that goes to Supreme Court and there's like a tiny little shift on the Fourth Amendment, right? But it's like an individual thing. And for me, it was coming out of that, being like, okay, well, how can I start to create systemic change where I might not be able to have that relationship with clients, I might not be able to see the impact, but I know from like the data and research, right? Or from the community with impacted folks, right? I know that I'm making a broader change. And I think there's no reconciling the two. I think we all are looking for like reconciling, and if you're going to be a public defender, you're a cog in the wheel and you're in the trenches and you're pushing back, but you're still an outside lane because you're pushing the dominant institutional actors, right? And oftentimes public defender offices then do stuff like impact litigation, or they have a policy division, right? So there's ways that public defenders are trying to expand out of that to do more of the outside lane work. But we can talk about it more in office hours, as Karen said in the chat, I think. So I think, Karen,
So
are you?
thank you, Julian. And oh no, sorry, can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm getting the internet is unstable. So sorry about that. I think my kids are on the internet now that they're out of school. So I was trying to say thank you, Julian. And I know we met our time and then some. I wanted to thank you for sharing your wisdom and time with us. Maya and Angel for jumping in as kind of student questioners. And I am so sorry we didn't get to everything that was asked in the Q&A. I will say for UCLA students, please You can come to the informal career talk that's on Wednesday, so you have a chance to chat with Julian in that setting, or for one-on-one office hour meetings. If you are not a current UCLA student, my email's in the chat. You can email me if you would like to speak directly to Julian. And I do also want to thank UCLA alum, UCLA law alum Maggie Levy, who I believe is in the audience. I saw her in the list of participants. Her support has made today's program possible. And then to all of you, thank you for joining us. Have a great week, and we'll see you in the ongoing fight for racial and social justice. Thank you, everyone.